Hello, friends, and welcome to. Sorry about this. Just having a little bit of technical difficulties. Okay. Hello, friends, and welcome to our Wednesday evening live stream offered to you here from Empty Cloud Monastery. I hope that you're all doing well, and whether you're watching this live in the live audience online, or if you're watching this some other time after it's been recorded and put up on the channel, I hope that your practice is progressing and that you get some benefit. It's already wonderful that you're coming to listen, coming to hear the teachings and to reflect on them and to try to apply those to your life is already a good thing to do. And here at the monastery tonight, we chanted the Mangala Sutta. And in the Mangala Sutta, the Buddha says that one of the highest blessings for life is to hear the teachings. And so, yes, and also to discuss them. And so if you have any questions about the sutta, which we will be finishing up, then please feel free to leave those questions online in the live chat box, and I will try to get to those at the end. And so we will be continuing our sutta, which we've looked at in the past. We'll be continuing with Majjhima Nikaya, that's the middle-length sayings of the Buddha, the middle-length discourses. 122, the greater discourse on emptiness, or the Mahāsuññatasutta in Pali. And so this is a sutta on emptiness, which we have already read through some of together, and you can see that if you haven't in the previous video, part 1. And so hello to Sean and Sadhu Sean for your thoughtfulness, as well as Richard, Jody, Monal, and Mary. So everyone who's joining in live, hello to everyone who's mentioned, or if you are a silent watcher, a silent lurker, as I've seem to believe that there are some who do not leave comments although they watch. So hello also to you. And so at this time I will render homage to the Buddha, our original teacher, and the reason that we have the ability to read and reflect on these teachings in the first place. And then we can go ahead and start reading through the discourse and leaving any comments as necessary. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sanghaṃ Saranang Gacchāmi. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. And so where we left off in this sutta, for those who remember, and if you weren't there, then you can get a little ideas. The Buddha was talking about the importance of not enjoying company and the importance of enjoying being alone. And how it's not possible for someone to attain the benefits of meditation and attain awakening if they enjoy company. And so then the Buddha started talking about how it's important to enjoy being alone, and also how he himself, whenever people come to visit him, he gives talks inclining people to go off and be on their own. And it actually reminds me of some of the famous, or maybe famous teachers, monks, and so on from Thailand. Some of them, like there was one who I know very little about, but his name was Longpo Dun, and he very rarely gave Dhamma talks, and he would basically just answer questions. And I remember hearing that Ajahn Passanno, which is Bhante Sudhasa's preceptor, if you know him. He used to be the abbot of Wat Pah Nanachat, so a forest monastery in Thailand, established for foreigners by Ajahn Chah. And apparently Longpo Dun showed up, and he brought his followers for Ajahn Passanno to give the Dhamma talk. So it's kind of like if you're at the monastery, and the Buddha, obviously it's not comparable to the Buddha, but it's like and maybe like Venerable Sariputta or something, some kind of famous disciple believed to be an arahant, shows up and it's like, how about you give the Dhamma talk? But anyway, and similarly, I've heard stories of monks. Like I remember hearing a story of a monk who, I think his teacher maybe rarely spoke on Dhamma, didn't give many explicit teachings in that way. And I think there was one evening he was saying where his teacher was meeting with someone, and he thought, oh, this would be a good opportunity to hear the teacher speak Dhamma. He finally, at least if I remember correctly, or at least the instruction that we can gain from, is that his teacher, he was thinking, oh, he's going to talk about Dhamma, so he's interested. Like, what is he going to say? With this well-respected layperson, thought they were going to have a conversation, maybe learn something, and so on. And they basically spent the entire night just talking about worldly things, and then the teacher went off to bed. And apparently, the teacher said, yeah, he doesn't really talk about Dhamma with many people because they just don't really get it, and it just causes arguments or something. So actually, there are many teachers who are kind of known for that. They just don't. I mean, at least some of them, but they just don't really. Sometimes they don't necessarily talk very much, and they just kind of incline towards sending people away. So the Buddha says that when he's practicing meditation, then when people come and visit him, he gives them talks inclining towards sending them away. And the way I take this is also in other suttas, there are times when someone will come up to the Buddha and they will say, oh, could you please give me an instruction? I would like to go and retreat and practice. And the Buddha says, yeah, that's exactly what some people say, but then they just keep following me around. And then they kind of beg the Buddha, please, I really will practice. And so then he gives them a teaching. And so what the Buddha is kind of saying there, right, is he gives people, as in this sutta, he wants to give people a talk that will then they'll go off on their own and practice it. Not something that they'll just listen to and then kind of follow him around and be sociable, but rather he wants to talk to people so that they will go off, not to kind of hang around too much. So that's the kind of theme here. So the stories that I told might not be accurate, but at least those are instructional in terms of relating this to a kind of a more modern idea of what that might kind of sometimes be like. And so then the Buddha was talking about how someone might try to develop meditation on emptiness, as he does, where he doesn't focus on any signs. But he says that they might be developing meditation, and then they try to focus on emptiness. They try to develop a perception of emptiness, but it doesn't work. So then he says, where we left off, he says, first he says they should be aware of the situation. So they should be aware. The word is sampajana. So they should be aware of what's happening in their meditation, aware that it's not working, basically, right? And so the important lesson of that was, when we're practicing meditation, we should be aware of what we're doing and how it's working to some extent, right? If we are meditating and kind of hammering away and not getting anywhere, not really being aware of what's going on and so on, then we might just be wasting a lot of time. So I think that the main instruction here that the Buddha is giving is, again and again, he kept repeating how they should be aware, they understand what's going on, that it's not working. So the idea being here that, we have to be aware of how is our meditation progressing or not progressing, as the case might be. And so then the Buddha said that if it's not working, he says, then that mendicant should still settle, unify, and immerse their mind in samadhi internally, using the same meditation subject as a basis of immersion that they used before. So what he's saying is that if someone is trying to focus on emptiness, or also he mentions the imperturbable, which, as we mentioned, it seems to be referring to people who are trying to develop the formless attainments. So the idea being here that he's talking about how someone enters the jhanas, they attain the jhanas, and then from those they try to focus on either emptiness or the imperturbable. So what those seem to have in common from the descriptions of the suttas is that the imperturbable, like I said, those refer to what the Buddha called formless attainments, advanced meditation attainments for some advanced practitioners, where they don't experience any form whatsoever. They experience only space without any boundaries, or a consciousness without any boundaries, nothingness, or neither perception nor non-perception. So very rarefied states, the last two of which the Buddha's former teachers had practiced. And so that's one thing that in the suttas, those attainments, people who attain them, they first attain the jhanas. And then from the fourth jhana, they then go on to attain the immaterial attainments if they have that capacity and if they have that inclination. So someone can't really, it seems, at least from the suttas, that someone can't really just attain the immaterial attainments right away. They have to go through the jhanas. And So in this case, the Buddha is describing someone who they attain the jhanas, but then they try to attain the formless attainments, but it doesn't work. So then he says they should go back to developing the previous meditation theme that they were doing, right? So they should just basically stabilize their foundation before trying to move forward, right? And then similarly, he says if they're trying to focus on emptiness internally, externally, or both, and it's not working, then they go back to their former meditation subject, right? And I think part of the idea here is that the Buddha defines emptiness meditation in this sutta in the beginning. He defines it as someone who doesn't focus on any signs. They don't focus on any characteristics, on any features, meaning that they enter into a state where their mind is really not perceiving anything except absence. It's perceiving just the emptiness of characteristics, right? And so you might be familiar with this if you remember the previous sutta that we discussed, the shorter discourse on emptiness, where the kind of culminating meditation state of that before someone attains awakening was called the signless immersion of the heart, the animitta ceto samadhi. And the Buddha described how that is an advanced state of meditation, of samadhi, wherein someone does not perceive any characteristics, but they focus their mind essentially only on the absence of characteristics. And that is why it's a culmination of the meditation on emptiness, right? Because emptiness, what does the Buddha have you doing in that meditation? He wants you to focus on absence. So usually we focus on what is present, but he wants you to try to focus on, can you focus your mind on something that's actually absent? And you can, right? You can focus on like, oh, I'm not sick right now. You can actually focus on that. So it can actually become like an object of your attention, right? It's something that you're aware of. And so if you took that to the extreme, could you focus on the absence of everything without actually anything being present except for the concept of absence? And the Buddha describes that, yes, someone can do that, right? If they attain the signless immersion of heart, wherein they don't actually perceive anything whatsoever, but they only perceive the absence of characteristics. So that's one way that the Buddha talks about emptiness meditation. And in this sutta, that seems to be what he was referring to at the beginning, at least some kind of form of that. And so in terms of the details, it seems to me that possibly the signless immersion, someone could attain it without being awakened. There's actually a sutta that talks about how someone could attain the signless immersion, but then they actually might even disrobe or later fall from it. I can't remember the exact details, but it talks about how basically they can fall away. And the point being that, you're not necessarily awakened just because if someone can attain that. But when the Buddha talks about himself entering emptiness, where he doesn't focus on any characteristics, it's also possible that he's talking about an advanced state that only arahants or awakened beings or enlightened beings of some kind can enter into. Because there are other suttas, it starts to get technical, so don't worry if the details are overwhelming, but just because we might as well talk about it because we're doing a sutta study. There are other suttas which people will ask, like, what is the signless immersion of heart? Is it, how does it relate to other states like emptiness and so on? And in those suttas, sometimes what they'll do is they'll actually say, in one way, they're the same thing, and in another way, they're different. And they're the same because in the suttas, it will say, greed is a creator of signs. Greed creates signs, creates features, characteristics. Hatred creates characteristics, signs. And delusion creates signs. And so one way of interpreting, like, what can animitta mean, signless, right? One way it's kind of described in the suttas is actually synonymous with awakening. Because an awakened person, although their mind actually might be perceiving objects, like they can perceive, for example, chairs, right? They can perceive people and they can still function. They can use language and so on. But their mind doesn't pick up on those characteristics and reify those things, right? It doesn't reify those objects or those experiences or whatever into things to grasp onto. So the suttas say that greed, like desire, it is a creator of signs, because with greed, with desire, that's what it kind of reifies things so that we experience them with certain characteristics, right? Characteristics like permanence, stability, reliability, taking them personally, believing that we own them, believing that we control them, believing that they belong to us, believing that, developing perceptions of aversion and so on. And so actually, from the perspective of someone who, I should say, like for the Buddha, although he can still perceive the same objects, the same types of stuff, his mind relates to it in a totally different way, right? He doesn't relate to it as something to grasp onto. Now, in the Mahāsuññatasutta, so the sutta that talks about the story leading up to the Buddha's passing and then his passing away and after, the Buddha in there, he says, he tells Ananda that his body is very old now, and that it's like a cart which is kept going just by being held together by straps. So he talks about how his body is old, and the Buddha suffered from back pain and other things, like he got sick and so on. And so in that sutta, he says that the only way that he can find comfort from the pains of his body is when he actually he stops focusing on certain signs and he develops a signless meditation. So just like in this sutta, there are several suttas which the Buddha talks about his own practice of signless meditation. Like it seems something that he liked doing, right? And he explains it as emptiness, actually. So one way of interpreting that, right, is that he is basically meditating on how his experience of pain, he's removing his mind, fixating on the characteristics of it, right? So, like for example, if you're suffering from intense pain, well, the Buddha is saying that that's his pain medicine. It's his signless meditation. And so how would that work? Well, if he focuses his mind on the absence of the characteristics of pain, then he might just not perceive the pain anymore. He perceives the absence of pain. So that would be one way of explaining it, which would seem to make sense. And so he can kind of just like see through the pain, right? And you might think, how is that possible, right? If something is present, how can you make it go away? And that's because if you have attachment, like if you have desire and aversion and delusion, your mind can't just drop things, right? When we have attachments, our mind fixates on things, it picks them up. But if you don't have any attachments, then at your will, you can just let go of things, right? So the Buddha, because he had no attachments whatsoever, his mind was completely free. Then if he wanted to, he could just stop focusing on the signs and features of pain and just perceive the pain is gone, perceive it as absent. He could see through it, so to speak, right? See it as non-substantial and so on. And so see it as not belonging to him. And in that way, he might just either not perceive it or not be affected by it in the same way. So that's kind of a lengthy conversation, but the point is that I think that when the Buddha is talking about him practicing emptiness by not focusing on any signs, he could either be talking about a state of samadhi which anyone could attain, including himself, or he could be talking about an advanced state of samadhi which enlightened beings attain, which is similar to the one that some non-enlightened beings can attain, but which goes even further, right? Which is like using their insight to see through all characteristics and not perceive things for a temporary time. So that's a little bit of context, because the sutta actually doesn't really explain, what does it mean when it says they focus on emptiness internally, externally, and so on. It seems like it's really just talking about basically focusing your mind to see through things, right? So like seeing through them to perceive them as empty, perceiving them as not substantial, and then perceiving the absence of them, not getting fixated on them. And so then the Buddha says, so continuing our sutta, after they then go back to their basis, right? So they try to do that, but they can't. So then he says they should go back using the same meditation subject as a basis of immersion that they had used before. So like, for example, let's say that they were meditating on the breath, and then they attain the jhana or something, and then from there they try to focus on emptiness, but it doesn't work. So then their mind wavers. So then the Buddha is saying, okay, just go back to what you were using before and stabilize your mind again. Redo it, basically, restabilize. And so then he says, okay, from there, the next part, he says, they focus on emptiness internally, and their mind does leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided. In that case, they understand that they are focusing on emptiness internally, and their mind does leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided. In this way, they are aware of the situation. They focus on emptiness externally, and their mind does leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided. In that case, they understand that they are focusing on emptiness externally, and their mind does leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided. They focus on emptiness internally and externally, and their mind does leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided in that. In that case, they understand that they are focusing on emptiness both internally and externally, and their mind does leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided in that. They focus on the imperturbable, and their mind does leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided in that. In that case, they understand that they are focusing on the imperturbable, and their mind does leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided. In this way, they are aware of the situation. Okay, so now the Buddha has just put the opposite scenario. So someone who they restabilize their meditation, and then they are able to go on to the next step. So whether they then want to move on to the formless attainments, he says after they restabilize it, they might then be able to actually do that. Or they want to go to the emptiness, and which is, you could say that the emptiness would kind of count as a form of, no pun intended, a form of formless meditation, because they're also not perceiving form. But it's not usually considered in the list. Like I mentioned, because it seems that the suttas kind of lump this almost closer to the using insight to develop samadhi type of thing. And so, at least sometimes. And so they do that. And so notice here that it also says the same thing. They are aware. So what is the lesson for this? Because I imagine that most of us, we're not going to be, this is not our daily, this is a very advanced state of meditation. So most of us are not going to be attaining this at all right now, right? So, it's not easy to attain the first jhana, let alone the fourth jhana, let alone the formless attainments. Some arahants don't even experience them. And so what is the immediately practical? Of course, this should inspire you and let you know, this is what the Buddha is teaching. He's not teaching us to settle for some mindfulness-based stress reduction, but he wants us to actually develop deep meditation to the best, try to practice that. But what is the more practical, immediate instruction is, as he says here, itiha tatha sampadana hoti. So being aware if your meditation is progressing or not, and if it's not progressing to the next step, you need to go back and restabilize the previous step. That's the main teaching here. He's just applying it to a specific context, right? So like, let's say, for example, that you're trying to develop some kind of practice, like you are trying to maybe you want to focus more on the breath, or you want to have more focus, right? You want to have more stability of mind. Like you want your mind to be more still, less moving. But you notice that it's not. So then what is the step before that, right? So restabilize. So like, for example, if you find that your mind is wavering around on your, say, the breath, maybe you should go back and restabilize it to just be aware of the present, right? So can you just settle your mind in the present? Then if you can just settle it in the present generally, then can you allow it to be stable with the breath, right? Or like, let's say that you have it settled in the present and you want to focus on the breath, but it's not working. So then you check, like, well, when you're focused in the present, can you do that silently without any thoughts? Or is your mind still reacting to the present, right? So you kind of try to go back to the previous step. Or if you sit down and meditate, you're trying to progress, you're trying to, hammer away at the breath or whatever, and it's not working. If you're not aware of what's going on, like he's saying here, then could be wasted time. But if you're aware, maybe you actually need to go back to the very beginning, and you need to kind of reset the whole thing, redo the whole meditation process, readjust your intentions, readjust your attitude towards meditation, the whole, entirely. So we need to we need to be aware of what's happening in our mind, and then we have to respond accordingly, especially understanding, like, what is the step before this one, which is the same idea, of course, in the gradual training, right? The Buddha's gradual training, where he talks about different steps that one follows in order to develop the path. And of course, it's not always meant to be gradual, but there is a gradual nature. There's a gradual component. There is an aspect of the practice which is step by step, right? Although sometimes there are feedback loops, like you develop your virtue and then your meditation might get better. And when your meditation is better, you develop more virtue because you're more aware of your intentions. So sometimes there's a feedback loop, but at the same time, there's also a gradual part, right? So maybe, for example, if you have a very hard time meditating, maybe you need to go back to the step and stabilize your generosity, your virtue, your sense restraint, something like that, right? So the Buddha actually explains the steps in order to get to the meditation, and it doesn't just start with sitting down. Sitting down is like near the end of the gradual path. If you printed it out, probably it'd be like the last third, I imagine, or maybe like the second third, yeah, maybe like the second third, because it's the Buddha gives a long explanation of sila, of virtue, and then he gives a long explanation of things like, for example, sense restraint and contentment, and he talks sometimes about moderation in eating, sometimes devotion to wakefulness, and then frequenting a secluded place. So by the time that you get to the sitting down, it's actually pretty far down the path. And so sometimes we have to look, like, should I stay, if our mind is not leaping forth, right, gaining confidence in something simple even, then maybe we have to go back. And so this is one of the practical ways of applying this particular teaching here. Okay, so now we are moving on to the next kind of stage of this sutta. So it's a transition. The Buddha says, while the mendicant is practicing such a meditation, if their mind inclines to walking, they walk, thinking, while they're walking, bad, unskillful qualities of covetousness and displeasure shall not overwhelm them. In this way, they are aware of the situation. While the mendicant is practicing such a meditation, if their mind inclines to standing, they stand, thinking that while they're standing, bad, unskillful qualities of covetousness and displeasure shall not overwhelm them. In this way, they are aware of the situation. While the mendicant is practicing such a meditation, if their mind inclines to sitting, they sit, thinking that while they're sitting, bad, unskillful qualities of covetousness and displeasure shall not overwhelm them. In this way, they are aware of the situation. While the mendicant is practicing such a meditation, if their mind inclines to lying down, they lie down, thinking that while they're lying down, bad, unskillful qualities of covetousness and displeasure shall not overwhelm them. In this way, they're aware of the situation. While the mendicant is practicing such a meditation, if their mind inclines to talking, well, actually, let me pause here. I apologize. I just think we should talk about the postures first. Okay, so see, what is the message? The Buddha says that, imagine that someone is practicing, right? They're trying to develop emptiness meditation, and then their mind inclines to walking. So like, maybe they're sitting for a while, and so then they want to start walking, maybe do walking meditation, right? Or maybe they just need to get up and go somewhere. And he's saying that basically they should, or, he's giving basically an instruction here, describing it in just what they do, but he's saying, this is what they should do, essentially, is that they should be establishing in their mind that while they're walking, they will not let bad, unskillful qualities, right? So qualities, dhammas, which are unskillful, which are suffering, which create suffering. They need to, especially, he says, covetousness and displeasure, abhijja domanassa. And it's the same when it says if they incline to standing. So like, let's say, for example, that they're practicing the meditation in the sutta, and then it's time for them to go alms round, right? So then they get up and they start walking into the village, and then they're standing in the village. So then if they're standing, they should also be thinking that they don't want qualities of covetousness and displeasure to overwhelm them while they're in the standing posture. And then let's say they go back to sitting down to eat their meal. So then while they're eating their meal, while they're sitting, they also need to establish that they won't let bad, unskillful qualities of covetousness and displeasure overwhelm them. And then lying down, let's say after the meal, they decide to lay down in the lying posture to just rest their stomach for a little bit. And at the same time, they should also then be thinking they will not let bad and skillful qualities overwhelm them of covetousness and displeasure. So while they're, essentially, this is talking about when they exit the formal meditation, and then they're just, walking around, standing around, sitting in, some other posture, or lying down, then they need to be mindful. It says they should be aware of the situation. So they should have sampajanya, again, meaning that, not just doing these things like, okay, they meditate, and then as soon as they get up, they just immediately are just distracted by what's going on, and that would just be wasting what they just done. So here the Buddha is really, talking about the importance of when we're not in formal practice, we're not actually formally sitting down, trying to develop mindfulness and so on, then it's still very important that we are guarding our mind, right? Because our mind does not recognize a distinction between formal meditation and not formal meditation, right? For our mind, everything is formal meditation. Like if you're training your mind to be, if you train the mind to be interested in the world of the senses, it doesn't matter whether you're sitting down or not. Your mind doesn't care. All it knows is that you're teaching it to follow desire. And if you train your mind to incline towards distraction, towards daydreaming, it doesn't matter whether you're sitting down or not, whether you're quote unquote formally meditating. Your mind doesn't know that. Your mind doesn't speak that language. So, like for example, we have a monastery cat here. He doesn't understand what we're doing when we're sitting down meditating. All he knows is that we're doing something really weird. We're just sitting there, staring or something, sleeping maybe. So he doesn't know what we're doing. But he knows that we're not paying much attention to him, and he knows that it's strange, and he probably thinks that we are super crazy. So for him, all he knows is whatever we're doing, he's learning from that. He doesn't know like, oh, now's the time to be quiet or whatever. He kind of sometimes gets the gist and lays down to sleep. So sometimes our mind is like that, right? You say you're going to do some formal meditation, and your mind's like, oh, it's time to take a nap then. Or your mind is like Teddy the cat, and it starts yowling and screaming and howling and yapping and making about every single possible noise that a cat can make. And so you sit down to do formal meditation, and your mind starts freaking out. And so your mind doesn't know what's going on. All it knows is you're doing something really weird. You're not engaging in what it wants to do. So either you're sleeping or you need to be disturbed. You need to get out of this. So it's the same. Like we have to train our mind all the time. And because it doesn't, the distinction between formal and informal practice is one that we make, not one that our mind makes. And so when we are just sitting around, right? So like for right now, for example, I'm sitting, right? So I'm not doing formal meditation. So when we're sitting around, or if you are walking around, if you are standing somewhere, if you're lying down, then as long as you're awake, we should be inclining to developing awareness of what we're doing, specifically trying to avoid covetousness and displeasure from overwhelming us. What does that, those sound like kind of fancy words, especially covetousness, right? Sounds like it's from the King James Bible or something, but covetous means essentially the word here is just talking about desire, right? Covetousness and displeasure, it just means desire and aversion. That's what the Buddha is talking about. So liking and disliking in the sense that overwhelms the mind, right? So for example, you come out of meditation and then you see something that you like. So then you start getting obsessed about it. You start getting distracted by it, losing your awareness of your mind, losing the trying, not being aware of what you're doing, not guarding your senses, but just getting distracted in the tasks or whatever, or in the thing or in the thing. Or if it's aversion, then you start getting angry or irritated about things, right? So in meditation, we have to set aside. The Buddha defines how does one meditate. He says they meditate atapi sampajano satima vinaya loke abhijja domanasa. They meditate with a sense of energy, with awareness, and with mindfulness, having removed covetousness and displeasure, having removed desire and aversion in regard to the world. So you might not have heard it phrased like that, but actually that's basically how everyone teaches meditation, right? When you sit down to meditate, what do we say? Don't be concerned about the things of the world, right? Don't get caught up in liking, don't get caught up in desiring to do something else and daydreaming about your fantasies, and don't get caught up in anger and irritation and aversion towards the things going on around you or whatever, the past or the future. You have to meditate just focus with a sense of energy, awareness, and mindfulness, rid of any kind of interest or irritation towards the world outside, towards anything other than the meditation. So when the Buddha describes sense restraint, which is the practice which kind of immediately precedes mindfulness, he says that they restrain their faculties so that abhijja and domanassa don't overwhelm them. And then he has you practice mindfulness meditation where you're supposed to have removed abhijja and domanassa. So that's why this all fits together as a piece, right? So if we are outside of meditation, allowing desire and aversion, liking, greediness, and irritation, if we are allowing those things to overcome our mind, then when we sit down to meditate, we won't have put those things aside in regards to the world. We'll still have them. So then our meditation won't be able to proceed, right? So then when you sit down to meditate, you'll be irritated, or you'll be restless because you're desiring things, or you'll be less interested in the meditation because you trained your mind to be interested in the world, right? So this is what the Buddha is talking about here, is that it's important that we establish in our mind, I will not be overwhelmed by these. I try not to be overwhelmed by these, right? And there's a really wonderful quote by the Buddha that I just found recently, was reflecting on recently, where the Buddha says, he says, "Dukham bhikkhave kusito viharati, aradhaviryo chako sukham viharati." So he says, "Dukham bhikkhave kusito viharati, voki no papakehi kusadehi dhamehi." He says that, monks, someone who is lazy lives in suffering. Aradhaviryo chako, someone who has their energy aroused, they live happily. And the way he explains this, he says that someone who's lazy lives in suffering, no because they're overwhelmed by unwholesome bad states, and and they waste much of their own good. So I thought that was really powerful teaching from the Buddha, like just a two-liner where he's saying, because usually we think that actually, we think it's suffering to practice. Sometimes it feels that way, but who really thinks that? Our defilements think that. Our defilements think it's suffering. Like the greed, I don't want to do this. I want to do what I like. And the aversion, I don't like this. And then delusion, wanting to be distracted, daydreaming, not being present. So who doesn't like practicing? Our defilements don't like practicing. Our ignorance doesn't like it. Craving doesn't like it. It's like anything but that. It's like when you go to the doctor and they need to give you a shot. And then the children, they start screaming, and the doctor has to say, "Don't you want some candy? I'll give you a sticker after." So, kids usually, they hate getting shots. They don't like it, even though it's good for them. So sometimes our relationship to practice can be like that, like, oh, I have to practice or whatever. I guess it's good for me. But actually, the Buddha here is saying the opposite. He's saying that someone who's lazy, actually, they live in suffering. And he says because they're overwhelmed by bad qualities. And it's actually, that makes so much sense. It's so true, because when you are, for example, it's suffering to be constantly pushed and pulled by hatred and liking and irritation. That's a state of suffering. It's actually happiness. Like if you have a lot of energy and your mind becomes very pure, you're not interested in the world, your meditation is progressing, you would live in happiness. You would have no defilements, you would have defilements, but they wouldn't be obstructing you, right? So you would actually be very happy. You'd be peaceful. You would be calm. You would be focused. You would be still. You would be progressing in your practice, developing your faith, developing your wisdom, developing your samadhi. So actually, if you have your energy aroused, if you're actually actively practicing, actually you're removing the causes of suffering. Why do we suffer? Because of defilements. Why are defilements there? Because we're lazy. Because we don't remove them. That's why. So although we tend to think that practice is suffering, actually it's not. Actually, not practicing is what makes us suffer, right? So I thought that was really powerful, just how he says that in the context of saying, monks, you need to make an effort. He says that actually someone who's lazy, they live in suffering. And then also he says they waste a lot of their own good. Meaning we have so much potential and we just waste it away. So actually that's a state of suffering, right? When you're lazy and you know that you could be doing more, you don't feel well. You feel like you're wasting your life. You feel like you're wasting away things. So although we like to be lazy, but actually it doesn't feel good. It actually is this state of suffering, because then when you're lazy, your practice deteriorates, and so your mind is corrupted by all these defilements, which are they suck. They're uncomfortable, and also then you feel like you're wasting your potential. You're wasting your goodness. So when you're energetic, then you actually feel like, wow, you're developing yourself, you're becoming better, and your mind, it becomes more pure, so then you have less suffering, right? So that is and he's using the same word, right? Bad unskillful qualities. So papaka akusala dhamma. This is a phrase the Buddha uses a lot. So this is something that we can remember, when we're not meditating, and then we think oh, finally the meditation is over, or you think oh, now you're just going to get distracted and so on. Well, especially if you're living a lay life, most of your practice will not be formal meditation, right? Most of your practice is not going to be on the cushion, unless you're on retreat or you set aside some time or you take some time off. So it is a state of suffering to live without your energy aroused. That's why it becomes stressful. Why do you get stressed? Because of defilements. Why do you have defilements? Because you're not guarding your mind when you're not meditating, right? So that's why we have these things. And so the Buddha's teaching here, I think, is in that context of that statement he makes about how, like, I find that really helpful to reflect, like, okay, so when you're out and about in the different postures, just remembering that actually we suffer when we become negligent. That's when all the suffering starts to overwhelm the mind. And the word he uses for this is, like here he says, anvasavisanti. So they will not overwhelm them. And the idea here is like flooding in, like flowing into the mind. So our mind gets flooded by desire and aversion. It gets pushed and pulled, like completely overwhelmed. And so then we are stressed, and then you might want to meditate to calm down, right? So then you have a long day at work, so then you try to meditate, and I mean, you might get some relief, but then you're just kind of constantly undoing all the stress from the day. So wouldn't it be so much better not to have it in the first place? And the meditation actually could go deeper than that, right? Instead of undoing all the stuff. So it's important to remember, like, this is very important that we always check our mind in all the postures that we're in. And so we should try to, walk with a sense of dignity. Like we should walk as practitioners, right? Not as just normal, untrained, unlearned, uninterested people with no spiritual practice. No, we should try to walk as if we were diligent cultivators, right? So when we're walking, are we mindful? Are we watching our mind? Are we being careful what we're doing with our eyes and our ears and so on? Are we developing a sense of peace in the present moment? So we want to walk with a sense of dignity and with purpose, right? With a sense of presence. And then when we're sitting around, right? And when we're lying down and so on. So if you'd like, for example, the Buddha recommended to monks that they lie in what's called the lion's posture. So that's where you lay on your right side, and that's basically the simplest way of saying it. You lay on your right side, and you do it with a sense of dignity. So kind of putting your body, stacking your body, and laying on your right side like that. So the Buddha gave that posture. That's what he recommended. That's what he said that monks should sleep in, and that's what he himself slept in. But also just lying down. So like if you do lying down meditation, you can lie down like the Buddha. So then you're lying down with a sense of purpose, right? A sense of mindfulness. So we can remember this and try to put this into our practice. And then he says, while the mendicant is practicing such a meditation, if their mind inclines to talking, then they think that they will not engage in the kind of speech that is low, crude, ordinary, ignoble, and pointless. Such speech doesn't lead to disillusionment, doesn't lead to dispassion, doesn't lead to cessation, doesn't lead to peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. Namely, talking about kings, or you could say talking about politics, bandits and chief ministers, talking about armies, threats, and wars, talking about food, drink, clothes, and beds, talking about garlands and fragrances, so perfumes and decorations, talking about family, vehicles, villages, towns, cities, and countries, talking about women, talking about heroes, talking about street talk and well talk about the departed, motley talk, tales of land and sea, and talk about being reborn in this or that state of existence. In this way, they are aware of the situation. Instead, they train such that they will take part in talk about self-effacement that helps open the heart and leads solely to disillusionment, to dispassion, to cessation, to peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. That is, talk about fewness of wishes, talk about contentment, talk about seclusion, talk about aloofness, talk about arousing energy, talk about ethics, talk about samadhi, talk about wisdom, talk about freedom, and talk about the knowledge and vision of freedom. In this way, they're aware of the situation. Great. So now you have the Buddha's list of good topics and bad topics, right? And so, of course, it's important to remember here that the Buddha is making a distinction here. Okay, so sometimes we have in the modern day, for example, you have silent retreats, right? Everyone is silent or practicing silence to generally most of the time. But when you're just most of the time, you're not always going to be silent. Sometimes you need to talk. So especially like a monk, like let's say the monk, they go on alms round, then maybe someone tries to talk to them in the village, or maybe they're practicing with like 3 other monks or whatever in the forest. So then every now and then they might gather to talk about something. So like, for example, the Buddha, one time he visited his disciples, and there were Venerable Anuruddha, so the Buddha's foremost disciple in the divine eye, in clairvoyance, and also some others. I think there was 3 of them total, so 2 others. And he visited them, and there's suttas which talk about their practice. So like, for example, they would meet every 5 days. So they would be silent basically most of the time, and they would just practice, kind of in the park or the forest or whatever. And then every 5 days they would meet, and they would talk about the Dhamma like all night long. So they would talk about their meditation, right? So, presumably they were talking about things which are about self-effacement that help open the heart and lead slowly to disillusionment. So things like fewness of wishes, contentment, seclusion, aloofness, arousing energy, virtue, samadhi, wisdom, freedom, and knowledge and vision of freedom. So they were talking about, for example, developing more contentment, maybe talking about developing their samadhi, maybe talk about being aloof, maybe talking about not being lazy, getting energetic, maybe talking about wisdom teachings, or how they can apply their wisdom, how can they develop their discernment, talking about developing peace, talking about and so on, right? So they weren't just talking about, as it says, politics, bandits and ministers, armies, threats, wars, family, vehicles. So that would be irrelevant, right? But it's important to understand that the Buddha is making a distinction here, not just with types of topics, but he's actually making a more crucial, fundamental distinction between 2 different types of talking. So the key part is actually the beginning part. So speech which is low, crude, ordinary, ignoble, and pointless, which doesn't lead to disillusionment, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. That's the thing. So for example, the Buddha here mentions talk about food. So let's say that you're eating some food and you start having an allergic reaction, and then you say, oh, I can't talk about this because then I'd be talking about low, crude talk. So you don't tell anybody. That would not be the point, right? Or maybe you're trying to go somewhere and you need to ask for directions, but you see here it says, talk about street talk, well talks, talk about towns, cities, and countries and villages. So you think, oh, I can't ask for directions to the other town because then I'd be talking about towns. Or talk about family. So maybe you stop talking to your family. Or talk about beds. So maybe you need to get some blankets for your bed, but you don't talk about beds anymore. Or talk about drink. So you need some water, but you don't tell anyone. Or talk about clothes. So the point is not that you don't ever talk about those things, right? Sometimes we need to talk about food. It's like, for example, here at the monastery, sometimes we see, oh, is someone bringing dana today? So it's not that we can't talk about that. But the point is the speech low, crude, ordinary, ignoble, and pointless? And does it lead away from does it lead to non-awakening? So that's the point. And this is a list of things which, generally speaking, low, crude, pointless speech is about these types of things, right? So you might start talking about, oh, did you hear who got elected? Oh, did you hear about the gangs in the area, or this color, that color, this sports team, that sports team? Did you hear about the different military tactics that they're using here and there? And oh, have you tried the food at this restaurant? And have you tried this type of food and that type of food? And oh, I love this. And how do you make that? And do you talk about clothing, like, oh, this looks so good, that looks so bad, and I like this company, not that company? Are you talking about, for example, heroes, like, oh, Superman, Spider-Man, who would beat each other in a battle? Talking about street talk and well talk, so just kind of gossiping about things, like in India, people would talk, they would go to the well, while they're getting water, they would just kind of talk, just chat, gossip. So the point is, we need to be mindful, like, is this speech purposeful? Is this speech about something that's relevant to spiritual practice? Does it lead to those things? And that's the main thing. Sometimes, we have to small talk. It would actually be almost like cultivating aversion if you don't, right? Like if someone asks you a question and you refuse to answer because it's not about fewness of wishes, contentment, and seclusion, then that would be rude, right? So sometimes you have to talk about things that are normal, right? But you want to check your minds, thinking that you won't engage in low, crude, ordinary, ignoble, pointless speech, which distracts your mind away from things. So whenever we're speaking, the idea is we should be aware: is this meaningful, purposeful, And ideally, it should be about actual spiritual practice. While the mendicant is practicing such a meditation, if their mind inclines to thinking, then they will not think the kind of thought that is low, crude, ordinary, ignoble, and pointless. Such thoughts which don't lead to disillusionment, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. That is, sensual, malicious, or cruel thoughts. In this way, they are aware of the situation. But instead, they will think the kind of thought that is noble and emancipating and brings one who practices it to the complete ending of suffering. That is, thoughts of renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. In this way, they are aware of the situation. Right? So here the Buddha is using the word vitakka, so thoughts, but you'll notice that he is actually defining that in the same way that he talks about the second factor of the Noble Eightfold Path, samma sankappa. Right? So there is nekkhamma sankappa, abhyapada sankappa, and avihingsa sankappa. And so here he has nekkhamma vitakka, abhyapada vitakka, and avihingsa vitakka. So sankappa and vitakka are often synonymous, in the suttas. So like right thought, right intention, kind of means the same thing in the suttas. Because the idea is intentional thoughts that you're cultivating, right? Not like a random kind of wandering thought per se, though that can also count. But the idea is like, what are you intentionally cultivating in your mind, right? What are you intentionally thinking about and directing your mind towards? So here again, you'll notice that sometimes people say, oh, just stop thinking. Well, here the Buddha is actually saying that if they're going to be thinking, if their mind is inclined to thinking, actually they should think, they will think the kinds of thoughts which are noble, emancipating, and bring one who practices them to the complete ending of suffering. So there are ways of thinking which are useful, right? And there are ways of thinking which are not useful. So what does it mean, sensual, malicious, and cruel thoughts? Well, it might seem obvious, but not necessarily, because actually, let's say that you are, again, similar to the talking one, like let's say that you start thinking about food, right? So that would be a sensual thought. But sometimes you need to think about food, for example, when you're eating it. So it's not a sensual thought to just be thinking about food. But the question is, are you thinking about something sensual with a sensual intention, right? Are you thinking about it with a kind of your mind inclining towards interest in absorption in the sensual aspect of it, right? So it's not just purely practical, but it's sensual thoughts means thoughts about sensual pleasures. So thoughts about sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches, right? Things that we experience with our physical senses. It's thinking about those things. So like, for example, if you're meditating and then you have a thought about the weather outside, okay, that's a sensual experience. So that would be distracting you from your meditation. You're actually supposed to be moving your mind away from that. However, that doesn't mean that you can't ever think about those things, right? So the point is, you look at your mind and think, like, when your mind is thinking, we try to stop directing our mind intentionally towards, in a way which is focusing on sensuality, right? Focusing on enjoying and delighting and relishing, cherishing, inclining and showing interest in sensual things for sensuality's sake, right? For the sake of sensuality, like out of interest for them. So if you're meditating and you start thinking about what you're going to make for dinner that night, that would be a sensual thought. If you're making dinner, then you just need to be mindful of what you're doing, right? Mindful that your thoughts don't become overwhelming and start to proliferate. And then malicious and cruel thoughts should be relatively clear, right? Those are pretty much always the case. Always pretty clear when what that might look like. So we just have to be aware, like, is our mind inclining to thoughts of aversion and thoughts of harming, thoughts of cruelty, and avoiding those, right? And instead, we should try to cultivate thoughts of renunciation, right? We should try to cultivate thoughts of non-harming and thoughts of goodwill. So thought of renunciation, this includes, like, when you're meditating, letting go of things, right? So it's not just thinking about renunciation, but it's using your mind, directing your mind towards renouncing, right? So it's not just a thought about harmlessness, right? You're not just thinking about harmlessness, but you're actually supposed to be thinking in a way that is harmless. You see the difference? So, like you could write a treatise on harmlessness, and that might or might not be useful. But actually, if you develop a mind which inclines towards harmlessness, which has harmless thoughts, that means that when you encounter things, you have a thought of kindness, right, of compassion towards them. So it's very different. Like cultivating compassion is different from thinking about something. So this is not thinking about, but it's thinking, right? And one of the ways that I think this is useful to talk about is like if I take the usual prop for these videos, if I take a cup and I say, think of this cup. So if I say, think of this cup, most people, if you're a native English speaker, you'll understand that I don't mean think about the cup. Like I don't mean start thinking about it. When I say think of this, it means kind of look at it, like put your mind onto it, direct your mind to it, and examine it with your mind, right? Direct your mind towards this thing. So thinking of something is different from thinking about something. And so in this way, we're trying to think in a way which is not sensual, and so on, and trying to think in a way which is about renouncing in the same way. So that's what the Buddha, when he's talking about right thought and thinking, this is what he means, right? So are you thinking in such a way that inclines towards renouncing, towards kindness, and towards compassion? And the point is that the Buddha says those thoughts are actually, if you develop those, that is actually noble and emancipating, and it brings you to the end of suffering. So it's good to do that, right? If your mind is constantly inclining towards letting go of things, that will lead you to the end of suffering. If you're developing loving kindness, that will lead you to the end of suffering. If you're developing compassion, that's inclining you towards the end of suffering. So see, that is actually good, right? Sometimes we need to do that. So like when you start focusing on your breath and you start letting go of your inclinations towards the sensual world, then actually you're developing thoughts of renunciation, even though you're not necessarily thinking about renunciation. So that's kind of what the Buddha is talking about here. Then the Buddha continues on this theme. He says, there are these 5 kinds of sensual stimulation. What 5? Sights known by the eye, which are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasant, sensual, and arousing. Sounds known by the ear. Smells known by the nose. Tastes known by the tongue. And touches known by the body, which are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasant, sensual, and arousing. These are the 5 kinds of sensual stimulation. So a mendicant should regularly check their own mind. Does my mind take an interest in any of these 5 kinds of sensual stimulation? Suppose that upon checking, a mendicant knows that their mind does take an interest. In that case, they understand that they have not given up desire and greed for the 5 kinds of sensual stimulation. In this way, they are aware of the situation. But suppose that upon checking, a mendicant knows that their mind does not take an interest in the 5 kinds of sensual stimulation. In that case, they understand that they have given up desire and greed for the 5 kinds of sensual stimulation. In this way, they are aware of the situation. Okay, and so here, again, the Buddha is continually, repeatedly, over and over again emphasizing being aware. So being aware whether our meditation is progressing or not, being aware whether we're inclining towards bad talk or good talk, being aware whether we're protecting our mind when in the different postures or not, being aware of how we're thinking and how we're not thinking, and so on. And similarly here, he's talking about how we should be reviewing our mind, being aware, does our mind take an interest in sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches, right? So I already kind of touched on this. He's building on this from the top where he just talked about right thought, right? So you check, right? Like, is my mind inclining towards those things? For most people, the answer is going to be yes, right? That's why we have a hard time meditating. That's one of the main reasons. So like, what do we tend to get averse about? Something that you see, hear, smell, taste, or touch, right? Generally speaking, it's going to be about something like that or something derived from it. So like if you're getting, you can't meditate because you're irritated, upset, or feel powerless about the wars in the world, that would be your mind is taking an interest in the sensual stimulation. If you are desiring cake, your mind is taking an interest in sensual stimulation. So it's basically everything that we're swimming in. That's what the Buddha is, it's almost always that. So for most people. And so taking an interest in checking, like, is my mind inclining towards those things or is it not? And being aware of that, right? Of course, just being aware is not enough. So if you notice, like, you do have your mind is taking an interest, and then you're aware, so that you just continue gladly on. That's not actually gonna, the point is that you should be aware, and then you should practice to remove it, right? But you have to be aware in the first place. So being aware is the first step. Like if we're just blindly following our interests, which again most people do, right? Then we will not even begin to start purifying those things. So we have to be aware, like, and as the Buddha says here, he says we should regularly check. He says we should check. Let me see here. What does he say exactly? Yeah, he says we should regularly check our own minds. So, like constantly checking or regularly checking, what is my mind inclining towards? And if your mind is not inclining towards, if your mind is inclining towards the sensual world, then of course this relates to the topic just before this. Then we should try to cultivate thoughts of renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. That would be kind of the response to that. And we should try to develop more peace, in meditation and so on. Try to protect our mind from desire and aversion and the different postures. Be careful about what we're talking about, right? Because all the things that the Buddha just listed before, those are things that, again, they relate to this thing here about inclining towards sensuality. So the types of low talk, that's all talk about sensuality, right? The getting obsessed with liking and disliking in the different postures, that would be about sensuality. The wrong thought, that would be about sensuality. So all the things that the Buddha said that are wrong, that would be training us to try to incline our mind away from those things. And the things that are right, those are the antidotes that we should apply. Then he continues, he says, a mendicant should meditate, observing rise and fall in these 5 grasping aggregates. They should observe such as form, such as the origin of form, such as the ending of form, such as feeling, such as the origin of feeling, such as the ending of feeling, such as perception, such as the origin of perception, such as the ending of perception. Such are choices, such as the origin of choices, such as the ending of choices. Such as consciousness, such as the origin of consciousness, such as the ending of consciousness. That's what they should be reflecting on. That's what they should be observing. As they do so, they give up the conceit of self, of I am, regarding the 5 grasping aggregates. In that case, they understand that they have given up the conceit of I am regarding the 5 grasping aggregates. In this way, they are aware of the situation. These principles, so the Buddha has talked about, are entirely skillful, with skillful outcomes. They are noble, transcendent, and inaccessible to the wicked one. So here the Buddha has just talked about, the whole time he's been talking about how someone is, describing a person who's properly practicing samadhi, right? And then finally at this point, he's now saying how they should then focus on the rise and fall, the udayabhaya, so the rising, the appearing and vanishing, the arising and disappearing of the 5 aggregates. So form, which is the physical experience, so physicality, feeling or sensation, perception or recognition, choices or intentions and mental intentional activities, and consciousness or awareness. And then, of course, the way he describes this, as is common in the suttas, is that they see the thing in question, how it arises and how it ceases. And he says this is how they give up the idea of of us, what's called asmimana, the concept of I am, right? So what does it mean to observe the origin and the ending in brief? Well, sometimes people think that this means like watching things appear and cease, but well, that might be, that is part of it and so on. That's relevant, but actually the origin of the aggregates is actually desire, and the ending of the aggregates is the ending of desire. So in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha defines in brief, right? What is the first noble truth? Sankitena pancha upadana khandha. So in brief, it's the 5 aggregates of grasping, which is what he's saying here, right? The pancha upadana khandha are what you should see the rise and fall in. And here he says you should see the samudaya of the pancha upadana khandha. So he defines the samudaya in the Four Noble Truths. He says the samudaya is tanha puno bhavika nandiraga sagata tatra vinandini. And actually there are suttas in the Khandha Samyutta, like for example the 5th one, I believe, where the Buddha actually defines, he says, what is form, what is the origin of form, and what is the ending of form. And there he defines the origin of form as desire and grasping. So So it's important to remember, like in the suttas, the samudaya, the origin, it doesn't just mean like the thing appearing. It means like, why does it appear, right? Origin means what is the cause of it. So it doesn't just mean like seeing it appear. It means seeing what is the origin? Why did it appear? And the reason, of course, is craving. That's why we have a body. That's why we have feelings, perceptions, volitions, and awareness. So it's because of craving. And it's because of craving that these things continue arising in successive lifetimes. And it's with the ending of craving that they can cease, right? So he's talking here about someone who sees the Four Noble Truths. This is another way of talking about that. So someone who sees the aggregates, which the 5 grasping aggregates, which the Buddha defines as the first noble truth. Someone who sees the origin of those, the samudaya, which the Buddha defines in the second noble truth. Someone who sees the ending of those, right, which is synonymous with the third noble truth, the ending of craving. And they do that via the path, which he's just described above. So that's what this stands for, just to be kind of clarifying, right? So, and then that's how they give up I am, right? Because someone who fully sees how their entire body and mind, everything, in existence, basically everything that they ever experience, if they see how that arises and ceases with craving, and it ceases with the ending of craving, then they won't have any more concept of I am. They won't have any more concept of self, any more concept of, they won't even have a subtle sense of their own kind of self-existence, right? Because they will see that actually everything that they would claim to be their own or whatever is merely a temporary arising and merely a temporary experience, which doesn't actually belong to them. It's not their true self. And so then they understand that they've become an arhat. So this is kind of the culmination, right, of the practice that we should try to aim for. And the Buddha is saying that these are entirely skillful, and they have skillful outcomes. They're noble, transcendent, and inaccessible to the wicked one. The wicked one is Mara, right? The king of death, the king of defilement and mortality, the one who tries to trap us in samsara. So he's saying these are inaccessible to the wicked one. So someone who's developing the practices above, they're becoming free of Mara, right? They're transcending the world and they're leading towards the wholesome. And the Buddha then continues, what do you think, Ananda? For what reason would a disciple deem it worthwhile to follow the teacher, even if sent away? Let me just check here. Okay. And Ananda says, our teachings are rooted in the Buddha. He is our guide and our refuge. Sir, may the Buddha himself please clarify the meaning of this. The mendicants will listen and remember it. Right, so this is a hint here. So the Buddha is asking Ananda a question like, what do you think, Ananda? Why would a disciple deem it worthwhile to follow the teacher, even if they're sent away, even if they're dismissed? And Ananda is kind of saying like, please tell us the answer. So this is a stock formula in the suttas for, they're saying like, please, can you just tell us and we'll remember it. And then the Buddha goes on to answer the question. He says, a disciple would not deem it worthwhile to follow the teacher for the sake of this, namely, statements, mixed prose and verse, or discussions. Why is that? Because for a long time you have learned the teachings, remembering them, rehearsing them, mentally scrutinizing them, and comprehending them theoretically. But a disciple would deem it worthwhile to follow the teacher, even if sent away, for the sake of talk about self-effacement that helps open the heart and leads solely to disillusionment, dispassion, cessation, peace, insight, awakening, and extinguishment. That is, talk about fewness of wishes, contentment, seclusion, aloofness, arousing energy, ethics, immersion, wisdom, freedom, and the knowledge and vision of freedom. Okay, so let's pause. So what is the Buddha saying? He's saying, why would someone follow the teacher? In this case, that means the Buddha. So this is an epithet for the Buddha. But you could take it as, Buddhism in general. But so he's saying, why would someone follow the Buddha even if he sends them away? Right? Remember that before he said that when people come to see him, including bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, then when he's practicing this meditation, he gives them a talk which tends to send them away. So, and I think part of the meaning of this might be like, even if the Buddha is kind of like, he doesn't really want to, not that he doesn't want to, but even if the Buddha doesn't really give them much attention, right? Like, so even if he's kind of sending them away, they're not getting to spend much time with it. Why do they continue to follow him, right? So many people, they go to teachers and they just want attention. So they just want the teacher to give them attention. or they want to be around the teacher. Like many people, for example, another story about Thailand is, for example, when Ajahn Chah died, a bunch of monks left. And apparently for like a year, the monastery was like a ghost town. And also similarly, like many monasteries, you have like a famous teacher and then they die, and then everyone, a bunch of people leave. So what the Buddha is saying here is like, that is not obviously, that's not the point, right? The point isn't to be constantly around the teacher, similar to what I mentioned before, where the Buddha said, like, sometimes people they say that they want a teaching from him, but then they just follow him around. They don't actually go away and practice. So he's saying, what's the point of following the teacher, even if they're not around him? Like, even if he's not giving them a bunch of attention and kind of caressing their ego and listening to everything they say, right? But why would they follow him? He says they wouldn't do it for the sake of sutta geya vyakarana. This is a word for basically the teachings, like the oral teachings. So translated here is statement, mixed prose and verse, and discussions. So there is a list of the, in the suttas, the Buddha there's never actually mention of like the Digha Nikaya, Majjhima Nikaya, Samyutta Nikaya, Anguttara Nikaya. Those things didn't exist. Usually in the tradition, it's said that they were arranged at the first council, or, probably realistically, possibly over time. So at the time of the Buddha, it seems that they didn't really divide the teachings as we currently do. But of course, they did memorize teachings, and they had the teachings. And there's a list of the teachings in the suttas. So it begins like Sutta Geya Vyakarana and so on. So in things like different genres of teaching, right? So for example, verses and mixed prose and verse and explanations and so on. So here the Buddha is listing 3 of them, Sutta Geya and Vyakarana, which some people believe to be kind of like early categories, like Suttan meaning simple statements, Geyang meaning suttas with verses or poetry or mixed poetry and verses, and Vyakarana being like explanations. So that would be a whole topic in and of itself. I don't think it's really worth going into right here. But the point is that this is a statement meaning basically what we would now call the suttas. So the Buddha is saying that a disciple doesn't follow the teacher for the sake of just the suttas, for learning the suttas, for hearing the suttas, hearing the teachings, memorizing the teachings. He says, because for a long time you have learned the teachings, remembering them, rehearsing them, mentally scrutinizing them. And he's telling Ananda, they've comprehended them theoretically. So he's talking to Ananda directly, right? So remember that this whole sutta started with the Buddha basically scolding Ananda, telling him that he shouldn't be socializing with people. And now that he's kind of coming back and he's saying, why do you follow the teacher? Why do you follow the Buddha? It shouldn't be for the sake of learning the suttas, memorizing the suttas, because you've already done that for a long time, memorizing them and rehearsing them, and mentally scrutinizing them and so on. So Ananda was famous for his memorization of scripture, right? He was famous for his learning and teaching of suttas, his learning and teaching of the Buddhist talks, the Buddhist themes, Buddhist doctrine. So Ananda was famous for that. And the Buddha is kind of saying, that's not the purpose of being around a teacher, actually. So of course, that's important. Of course, remembering that here the Buddha has already said that for a long time, they have done these things, and the Buddha elsewhere praises these things. But the point is that that's actually not the ultimate purpose, right? So we shouldn't learn Buddhism to get a kind of degree in Buddhism, right? That's not the point. So you shouldn't learn the suttas just to know the suttas, right? That's not the point of it. Although sometimes that can happen, right? So the Buddha here is kind of saying, especially to Ananda, right, in this particular context, because Ananda already has that tendency, he's saying, that's not the purpose, but rather they would deem it worthwhile to follow the teacher, even if sent away, for the sake of the talk that we mentioned before. So talk which is about self-effacement. So kind of ridding ourselves of making ourselves humble, making ourselves more pure, perfecting ourselves, right? Shaving off our defilements. Talk which leads to those things. And talk which opens the heart, right? So the difference here is that there is the suttas, and then there is basically talk directly about practice, right? Like direct exhortations. And this is talk which, as the Buddha says, like even if sent away. So for example, you might talk to someone and it might be very brief because the talk is actually inclining you to go away and be alone. That's different from like memorizing the suttas, right? Although they're related, but here the Buddha is saying that the reason that they follow the teacher basically is to get like direct instruction about their practice, about exactly what they're going through, and trying to get them to go off and practice, to actually realize things, not just about memorizing suttas or whatever. So that seems to be the distinction that the Buddha is making here. Is that even if the teacher sends you away, you deem it worthwhile to be around them, to follow them, because you're going to get direct advice about things that open your heart, that make you reflect on your direct immediate experience and send you off to practice directly. This being so, Ananda, the Buddha continues, there is a peril for the teacher, a peril for the pupil, and a peril for a spiritual practitioner. And how is there a peril for the tutor? It's when some teacher frequents a secluded lodging, a wilderness, the root of a tree, a hill, a ravine, a mountain cave, a charnel ground, a forest, the open air, a heap of straw. While meditating withdrawn, they're visited by a stream of Brahmins and householders and people of town and country. When this happens, they enjoy infatuation, fall into greed, and return to indulgence. This is said to be the tutor's peril. They're ruined by bad, unskillful qualities that are corrupting, leading to future lives, hurtful, resulting in suffering, and future rebirth, old age, and death. That's why there is peril for the tutor. So the idea here being that like someone, they go off to meditate alone and then they become famous for that. So then they get a bunch of people and then they get corrupted by the fame, corrupted by the attention, corrupted by the offerings, corrupted by the luxury, corrupted by the disciples or whatever. So the Buddha is kind of saying, when you have a person who is like in the position more of teaching, right? A person who's more in the position of basically receiving followers, then there's a danger that, well, because they're becoming well known, because they're getting attention, then they become corrupted by that. So then they fall away. So that's obviously a danger, right? That's very easily a danger to anyone who is practicing spiritual practice, because then, like, I remember actually in Italy, we're going to run out of time, but I remember in Italy, we were in this town and we were looking for a monastery, like, just a very simple building. And I think the person was telling us, I believe it was in this town, we were in a very rural part of Italy, like a mountain area. And they were telling us, I think in this area, like up the mountain, that there used to be Catholic monks there. And they would go off and they wanted to be alone. And as soon as the villagers found out that they were there, the village would start flooding there to get like blessings and to get like attention. So then the Catholic monks would move to try to get away, and then they would find them again. And so they were constantly moving like that. So the point is that, like, the more secluded you are, the more people want to see you because it's like, it's considered special. So there's this kind of dichotomy, this problem, where, people, they want to be around spiritual practitioners, but the whole point is they kind of to get away. So then the danger is that then you fall into indulgence, right? Or, you just get, you get attention, you get people, you get praise or whatever. So then the mind can become infatuated. The mind can become, as it says here, fall into greed and return to indulgence. So that's the peril that has to be avoided anytime we are in that position, right? And this is, generally speaking, this is more going to be people like monks, right? So that's how there's a peril for the tutor. And how is there a peril for the pupil? It's when the disciple of a teacher, emulating their teacher's fostering of seclusion, they frequent a secluded lodging, a wilderness, the root of a tree, a hill, a ravine, a mountain cave, a charnel ground, a forest, the open air, or a heap of straw. While meditating withdrawn, they're visited by a stream of Brahmins and householders and people of town and country. When this happens, they enjoy infatuation, fall into greed, and return to indulgence. This is said to be the pupil's peril. They're ruined by bad, unskillful qualities that are corrupting, leading to future lives, hurtful, resulting in suffering and future rebirth, old age, and death. That's why there's a peril for the pupil. Right? So also a pupil might then go off and follow the teacher's instructions. So even someone who's not a teacher, but then they, again, get a bunch of attention. And then they get corrupted because of that. And how is there a peril for a spiritual practitioner? It's when a realized one arises in the world, perfected, a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy, knower of the world, supreme guide for those who wish to train, teacher of gods and humans, awakened and blessed. He frequents a secluded lodging, a wilderness, the root of a tree, a hill, a ravine, a mountain cave, a charnel ground, a forest, the open air, or a heap of straw. While meditating withdrawn, the Tathagata is visited by a stream of Brahmins and householders, and people of town and country. When this happens, he doesn't enjoy infatuation, fall into greed, and return to indulgence. But a disciple of this teacher, so a disciple of the Buddha, emulating their teacher's fostering of seclusion, so someone who copies the Buddha and they go off to be alone, they frequent a secluded lodging, etc. And while they're meditating withdrawn, they're visited by a stream of Brahmins and householders and people of town and country. And when this happens, they do enjoy infatuation, fall into greed, and return to indulgence. This is said to be the spiritual practitioner's peril. They're ruined by bad and skillful qualities that are corrupting, leading to future lives, hurtful, resulting in suffering and future rebirth, old age, and death. Thus, so there's peril for the spiritual practitioner. And in this context, Ananda, as compared to the peril of the tutor or the pupil, the peril of the spiritual practitioner has more painful, bitter results and even leads to the underworld. So what is the Buddha saying here? It seems to be that he's saying that basically you have non-Buddhist people who, get obsessed and so on, and then you have Buddhist people. So he's kind of saying like it's even worse if a Buddhist, so a disciple of the Buddha, so the Buddha goes off and is secluded, he doesn't get infatuated by attention. He doesn't become overcome by greed because his mind is awakened. But then someone, does the Buddha's instructions, so they go off and they do that, and then they do become infatuated. And he's saying that as compared to the other people, like just other people, spiritual practitioners who that happens to them, the peril is even worse for someone who is a disciple of the Buddha. And he says even leads to the underworld, meaning it even leads to like an animal realm, ghost realm, or hell. So basically, if you have the Buddha as your teacher and then you fall into the peril that he's talking about here, it's worse than someone who is following an unenlightened teacher. And he says, so Ananda, treat me as a friend, not as an enemy. That will be for your lasting welfare and happiness. And how do disciples treat their teacher as an enemy, not a friend? It's when the teacher teaches Dhamma to his disciples out of kindness and sympathy. This is for your welfare. This is for your happiness. But their disciples don't want to listen. They don't actively listen or try to understand. They proceed having turned away from the teacher's instructions. That's when the disciples treat their teacher as an enemy, not a friend. And how do disciples treat their teacher as a friend, not an enemy? It's when the teacher teaches Dhamma to his disciples out of kindness and compassion. This is for your welfare. This is for your happiness. And their disciples want to listen. They actively listen and try to understand. They don't proceed having turned away from the teacher's instruction. That's why the disciples treat their teacher as a friend, not an enemy. So, Ananda, treat me as a friend, not as an enemy, the Buddha says. That will be for your lasting welfare and happiness. So again, here should be pretty clear, right? The Buddha is saying that, the Buddha has done this out of compassion, and he's saying, this is for your welfare. And then if we don't listen, we are treating him like an enemy. So when an enemy says something to us, we don't listen to them, right? When a friend says something, we trust them, we listen. And that's the kind of example. So he was saying, we should be his friend. So when he tells us to do something, we should do it. So he just told us a bunch of stuff to do. And then if we don't actually go off and do it, then it's as if he was our enemy. Then he says, I shall not mollycoddle you like a potter with their damp, unfired pots. I shall speak correcting you again and again, pressing you again and again. The core will stand the test. So I love this quote because, so what is he saying, right? Another way that you could take this is if you kind of read the Pali slightly differently and kind of, maybe there's an error, is Buddha saying, I will not stop working you like a potter with their damp, unfired pots, right? So a potter, they're kind of constantly shaping and working the pot, right? Or in the Sanskrit parallel, there's a note here that says, they will not mollycoddle you. So like a potter, there's two ways of taking it. Like someone who's working a damp pot, they hold it very softly, right? So they're kind of, maybe because it's soft, you're kind of working with soft material. So the Buddha is saying he's not going to work with us like we're soft little pots. He's going to speak, correcting us again and again, pressing again and again. The core will stand the test. or he will not stop working us. So another way of taking it is that, to shape something, you have to keep working at it. And he's saying he's going to keep correcting. So again, he's speaking to Ananda here. He's saying like, Ananda was just helping the monks make some robes right in the beginning, and the Buddha's like, don't socialize. And then he gives them a whole teaching, and he's saying, he's going to keep correcting again and again, working and pressing again and again, so that only the core will stand the test. So like so then when we are corrected of our faults, defilements, habits, and so on that are unwholesome, then, that is sometimes unpleasant, right? But the Buddha is saying the core will stand the test. So if we really have it in us, then we will make it through the pressing of the training, the constant correction and admonishment, and we will eventually, the core of us, which is trying to practice, that will stand the test of that. Otherwise, you might just, give up. So this is what the Buddha said. Satisfied, Venerable Ananda approved what the Buddha said. And so we can rejoice in the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Wonderful. And let's see. We are almost out of time, so just checking if there's brief questions that I can address. Joe says, Bhante, out of compassion, would you develop a mudita meditation to help beings develop empathetic joy and rejoice in the happiness of these states, so we may develop merit and create the causes to reach these states in the future? Meaning, if beings cannot attain these states yet, please help them learn how to appreciate and rejoice in happiness. Great. Okay, so it sounds like, Joe, you're requesting a mudita meditation. So maybe in the future we can do something like that. We can, yeah. And then our last question is from Lydia. So Lydia is saying, could you please explain what is meant by self-effacement in this context? And the way that I understand this, which is the word is saleka or abhisaleka, about saleka. You can actually read Majjhima Nikaya number 8, I believe, is called the sutta translated as self-effacement, where the Buddha talks about that. So the idea being like we're trying to shave off, right, our sense of self, our sense of ego, our sense of pride, trying to shave off our problems, our defilements, our habit tendencies, which are unwholesome, trying to develop ourselves, right? Not trying to build ourselves up or not be corrected, but rather trying to shave off these bad things and become more humble and so on. So I think that's the basic idea, is that there's particular ways of talking, teaching, instructing, and so on, which are directed right at us, right at towards what we need to develop, what we need to shave off. And so I think that's one way of relating to that. Okay, so everyone, please have a wonderful evening, night, morning, whatever time it may be for you, wherever you're watching this. May you be well, happy, peaceful, wherever you are, and may you attain the benefits and fruits of the practice as described in the sutta. And so we will see you for any future events and live streams at Empty Cloud Monastery. And in the meantime, may your practice continue progressing smoothly and peacefully. Have a good night.